a Mennonite minister of the gospel, also the executive director of Faith in Place. Faith in Place is an environmental not-for-profit that you should all love. We work with religious congregations on earth care, inspiring diverse people of faith to better earth care through our education, connection, and advocacy programs. We have an office right here in Chicago and many outreach staff that are ready to work with your local house of worship and help you take direct action, taking better care of the earth. I get the distinct honor of introducing Professor Michael Northcott to you all tonight. Professor Northcott is a professor of ethics in the School of Divinity at the University of Edinburgh, Scotland, and a priest in the Scottish Episcopal Church. He leads an Arts and Humanities Research Council large grant project entitled Caring for the Future Through Ancestral Time, engaging the cultural and spiritual presence of the past to promote a sustainable future. His recent books include Place, Ecology, and the Sacred, the Moral Geography of Sustainable Communities, A Political Theology of Climate Change, and he co-wrote with Peter Scott Systematic Theology and Climate Change Ecumenical Perspectives. Would you all join me in welcoming Professor Northcott to give us tonight?
Thank you very much for the introduction. It's a great pleasure to be here and an honour, and particularly grateful to Bill Kavanagh for inviting me to this very interesting conference. And to have Brian Suter, isn't it? Is that right? To have Brian introducing me is really extraordinary because, as far as I know, Faith in Place is the oldest faith-based environmental organisation, specifically faith-based environmental organisation in North America, and it's based here in Chicago. And I knew that, and I was going to refer to it in my talk, but then I found that the local manager of it is actually introducing me today. And he studied with a grad student of mine in Champaign-Urbana. So anyway, I didn't think I knew anybody in the Chicago area. So there you are. It's been great. So I said tonight that I would talk about this rather fancy title, Political Theology for Earthlings, Christian Messianism and the Ecological Ruins of Global Corporate Capitalism. Well, a couple of years ago, I went to Malacca, which is on the Straits of Malacca, across from the island of Sumatra. The Catholics got there first with the Portuguese in the 15th century and established a mission station there, and there's still evidence of Catholic presence and Catholic Portuguese Malay families. The whole culture there now of interesting mix of Portuguese, Chinese, Malay. And then the Dutch took it over, and then the British took it over. So this is actually a Dutch church taken over by the British, where I was sent on my first Christmas in Malaysia as a mission priest by the bishop just to go and take all the Christmas and New Year services. So I was going to teach in 2013 in Yogyakarta in the island of Java for the summer. And on the way I stopped with my friend who is area bishop and also rector of Christ Church Malacca. And I was due to preach on Sunday morning. And Saturday night, we'd gone out for a nice Chinese meal. And Saturday night, went to bed as usual. I remember waking up about 2 in the morning. And I smelled burning smoke. Really, it was coming through the air conditioner into the room. I mean, it wasn't in clouds in it, but I could just smell it. It smelled like a bonfire, actually. But then I hadn't quite got the set. At first I thought, Jason doesn't smoke. You know, my bishop friend. I don't think he smokes. And he likes a glass of whiskey, but he doesn't smoke. So I bought him some whiskey, but not cigarettes. Anyway, I'm not very risk averse. And I just rolled over and went back to sleep again. I mean, if the house had been burning down, I probably wouldn't be here now. But anyway, I got up the next morning and we saw this. You can just see the tip of Christ Church at Malacca there, the pink paint. And these are new buildings. But in fact, the smoke was thicker when I woke up than that. And basically what had happened was that overnight, fires lit in the island of Sumatra, which at the narrowest point of the Straits of Malacca is only 20 miles away, had been started up on virgin land, virgin forest, but also secondary forests adjacent to oil palm plantations. And the summer burning had begun. It's the dry season, and that's when they burn the forest to clear it for more oil palm. And these were pictures taken by Greenpeace of the burning in Sumatra. And of course, what happens when you burn the forest in a place like Sumatra or Borneo is that there's a risk of subterranean fires that start, and sometimes they can go on for years because the peat burns. And even if the peat doesn't burn, when you take the forest away, what you do is you change the whole ecosystem, and the land soon dries out, and of course, when it turns into an oil palm plantation, they put drainage channels in it. So as the peat dries, it then releases vast amounts of carbon into the atmosphere. So much CO2 is being put into the atmosphere by Indonesia and Malaysia from this process that Indonesia is the third heaviest carbon polluter in the world after China and the United States per person. Though it's not a very rich country. I mean, most people have got never on a bicycle. So, but it's because of this. It's absolutely extraordinary. And there's a satellite picture of the extent of the smog that overtook not only Malaysia and Singapore, but really the whole region, right across into the South China Sea in 2013. Now, as it happened, my sermon that morning was not written. I haven't actually got a talk here, but I probably won't always. I probably read it out word for word. But that day I didn't have a talk at all. But I like to preach on the hoof. I like to write. I like to preach. I like to be ready to preach the sermon I meant to preach on the day. So this was quite an event. So I naturally preached on it. But the great thing is with the Revised Common Lectionary, which I think we Catholics and Anglicans we now all follow, and I think Presbyterians do too. I don't know about Mennonites, but anyway, the great thing about the RCL is that it often, the way the readings come together often comes together with events. I find this over and over again. I don't know whether any priests, I'm an Anglican priest, not a Catholic priest, but I so often find this, I really like it. Now that day, the first reading was the story of Naboth's vineyard from 1 Kings 21. Now this is a classic biblical story about kingship and the perils and abuses of power and land theft. As you know, Naboth's vineyard was adjacent to the king's palace in Samaria, and Jezebel, King Ahab's wife, desired to take over the vineyard of Naboth and turn it into a vegetable garden for the palace. Very interesting that the Bible uses the phrase vegetable garden, because the vegetable garden is how Egypt is described by the prophets and in some of the law books, because it takes a lot of work to plant annual vegetables, whereas a vineyard is a form of permaculture, which clearly involves less effort and wouldn't have involved slavery, you see. So vineyards and olive trees and sheep are less labor intensive. So there's a whole kind of agrarian politics that's going on when it says that Jezebel, who was of course a foreigner, wanted to turn a vineyard, a piece of permaculture, into an annual vegetable garden. But when she approached Naboth and offered him an alternate vineyard, if he would give her his, he refused, saying that he received it as a nachalah. This is the Hebrew word, and it means as an inheritance. And he received it from God. In using this word, Naboth reminded her that the land ultimately belonged to God, who had first given the land to his forefathers, and hence it wasn't his to give up, since his God-given duty was to care for it and to pass it on to his children. Jezebel, of course, was not happy, and she arranged to have Naboth killed by calling false witnesses against him and accusing him of blasphemy against God, for which the penalty was death by stoning. After his death, she instructed Ahab to take possession of the vineyard, because Naboth had refused to give it to him for money. After the murder of Naboth and the land theft, Elijah comes along to see Ahab and tells him that because of what he's done, he will soon die, and his blood will be lapped by the palace dogs, a shocking and shameful death. This text drips with irony on so many levels. Jezebel was the king's foreign wife who worshipped Baal, and Elijah the prophet was in a life and death struggle with the cult of Baal to preserve the worship of Yahweh under a king, Ahab, who had allowed the cult of Baal to grow up because of his wife's influence. The text recalls the origin of Israel as a people on whom was conferred a covenantal gift of good land, on condition they worship the God who gave it to them, live justly in the land, observe the Ten Commandments, including the Sabbath, and kept themselves and the land holy. Ahab had compromised the worship of Yahweh, and he had polluted the land with murder as well as altars to idols, and so he would lose his inheritance, the prophet told him. And the text also carries that further meaning about the vegetable gardens. The Egyptians were great vegetable growers, of course, and they were forced in Israel. The Israelites were forced when they were in Egypt to sow seed and water it with their feet, like a vegetable garden. But the land they received from God was not like Egypt. Its hills were watered by rain from heaven, and hence it was the land which the Lord your God cares for, as the Deuteronomist puts it. Now we of course no longer think that rain comes from God, or that God lives in the sky. This is primitive thinking, though you can still see it on the walls and the roofs of many Catholic churches. It's pre-scientific thinking, but it carried with it a mythology not only of the relation of heaven and earth, but of the relation of people and land, of generation to generation, of the law of the land, which was that the land could not be alienated from the families to whom it had been given when God had originally given it. So in Israel there was a jubilee provision that when a family lost its land due to ill luck or poor farming practices, every 50 years the land was to return to the family which had originally owned it, and this is the law of the Jubilee. So this is an illustration of the extent to which Israel is rain-fed. And this is a very interesting economic graph of the US wholesale prices, which according to this graph seem to follow roughly a 50-year cycle. I really like this, because I think it suggests that quite often this is the case, that biblical law and natural wisdom and the design of human society are actually very interactive, and far more so than we can imagine. We forget the Bible, we forget what it means, we've completely forgotten about the Jubilee, but weirdly, it's still sort of operating in commodity prices. It's very, very interesting. It needs to operate in land prices. The forest in Sumatra has for millennia been inhabited by indigenous peoples who built their villages out of timber, planted rice and vegetables. I'm going to skip the next slide and get to where I want to go. I think, yeah, here we are. Planted rice and vegetables in small patches of land amidst the trees, and like most of the forest in the Indonesian archipelago, the land was not formally owned in the Lockean or modern capitalist sense of owned. Commons management had preserved this ancient forest until the late 20th century, so that not only was it peppered with small villages, schools, and vegetable gardens and mosques and churches, it was also home to orangutans, tigers, anteaters, and other wild inhabitants. The land of Sumatra, like the land of Borneo, the other large tropical forest island that is burned every summer and still shrouds the cities of Malaysia in haze from forest fires, and this is Borneo, has in the last 30 years gradually been transferred from communally managed forests into forest concessions, which are delineated by the Indonesian Forestry Department and the Sumatran state government and sold to multinational plantation companies of the kind that burned the forest in 2013. So the forest fires that shrouded Malacca, Singapore and KL in 2013 were the worst haze incidents since the burning of the summer of 1998. So these are people living in longhouses in Borneo, in fact. And this is what the land looks like when it has been logged and burned and prepared to be turned into a plantation. That's a young oil palm plantation. The land is bulldozed, contoured, and turned into this monocrop. And oil palm the crop is then harvested, the trees can be harvested after about 10 years. These trees originally came from West Africa, and then it's turned in factories like that into oil. And it's increasingly been used as biodiesel as well, because of this weird European and American idea that if we put biofuel in our tanks, somehow we'll save the planet. It's complete rubbish. The idea that you take food-growing areas like the cornfields of Illinois and put it in vehicles. In fact, the fossil fuels involved in growing corn and putting it in vehicles are their carbon footprint is higher than Saudi Arabian oil. It's not actually much lower than tar sands oil. So it definitely isn't a good idea. Palm oil, though, is in everything. It's a ubiquitous product. I'm quite sure it's in products in the hotel, a very nice hotel that I'm staying with on the lake. But it's in all of these products. Basically, Kroger's sells oil palm and fossil fuels, sugar, salt, meat, and starch. There is a vegetable aisle, I think, in shops like that, and Walmart too, but you know what I'm saying. So it's very hard to avoid it. But the market in oil palm is, the commodities that this product fuels, is an example of the larger problem of consumerism that is at the heart of the current ecological crisis that we face. And this problem of consumerism is, of course, also connected with the problem of population. As you can clearly see here, world energy consumption and world population pretty much map onto each other and continue to do so until what is hoped for decline in the human population by the end of the 21st century. But the way things are going at the moment, energy consumption will not decline and will continue to increase. And I'll go into some of the reasons for that later. Now, Chicago itself is a city of consumption. When I flew in, I haven't been on a long-haul flight since 2013, since I went to Java, because I try to limit the amount of flying I do for obvious reasons. I can't give talks like this and just fly around the world all the time. I do occasionally fly though, because I feel it's, the networks and so on, and what things that one can do. But anyway, I've never seen such a long queue of planes as was in O'Hare Airport when I arrived on Tuesday. I gather it's now the busiest airport in the world. So this, Chicago is a city of consumption. You know of what I speak, living in the city. The city is run in order to maximize consumption opportunities. And one of the other things the city is famous for is beef cattle lots. I think there are not so many now around the city. I think these lots like this are now mostly in Texas. But meat, flying, driving, these three behaviors alone, meat eating, flying and driving, if we could deal with them, we'd be halfway to dealing with the consumption problems which are destroying habitat like the one we just looked at. So not only are vehicles consuming vegetable oils, but of course animals consume vegetable oils. We've had some lovely food here, but in every meal there's always been at least one source of meat, sometimes two, and at lunch there were three. And many, I guess, don't think anything about that, don't think that it's strange. But the fact of the matter is, and we've talked a lot already in this conference, and there's been a lot of talks today, but I want to give just a few messages about what we can do about this stuff. If all of us in this room stopped eating meat and told our friends about it, and then their friends told their friends, and if our congregation stopped serving up meat at breakfasts and parish lunches and so on, we would start to make an impact. The quickest impact we could possibly make in reducing our consumption footprint would be to stop eating meat, even more than oil palm. But of course, as I said, meat is to raise animals like this, you have to feed them crops, which are often grown, as soya for example, and oil palm is often also in animal feed, on tropical forests, former tropical forest land. So this is an abundant planet, there's no question about that. But there isn't enough land. There won't be enough topsoil in the future to feed all the animals if all of us start eating meat like we're currently doing here in the West. And that's the same, it's true clearly of driving. To get back to Sarawak, I have to be careful what I say, because this man is incredibly powerful and his reach is right around the world. He's been the minister of that land, chief minister for 25 years. He's called Taib. He's built up a property empire, which is charted in a book published in Switzerland by Lucas Straumann called Money Logging. He rents buildings to the federal government. He rents buildings to the FBI in Seattle. He rents buildings to the Australian government in Sydney. He rents buildings in London, Singapore, Hong Kong, KL. He owns property all over the world. The property empire he has got from burning that forest or allowing other people to burn it is somewhere between 25 and 50 billion pounds. Now, the other problem, I think, with talks about the environment is that it makes it seem that we're all to blame and we all start to feel bad. But I think it's helpful at some point in these talks to focus on individuals. And I picked a man who I had no hesitation in picking on. Because I still don't understand to this day how he's still minister of a country when everybody knows what he's been doing for so long. That's absolutely incredible. Gordon Brown, our former Prime Minister of the UK, has spoken about this man and what's gone on in Borneo. It's not just a conspiracy theories. It's quite well known in NGO circles what's going on in that country. But unfortunately, Malaysian politics is extremely oppressive and there's no free press in Malaysia. So it's not talked about in Malaysia. It's really unfortunate. But there's only one word for what this man does, and it's sin. Greed. Well, I mean, that's more than one word. Wickedness. Evil. Absolute power. To take the homes of millions of people, millions of species. The thing that I got into the environment, really, through going to Sarawak, just I suppose why I still get very passionate about this issue. Because I was a missionary priest in Malaysia in the 80s, taught in a seminary, but I'd been a parish priest before, and I could well have gone back to a parish. I went on a trip up river with some of my students who were doing field placements in the longhouses, like the ones I showed you a few minutes ago, and in churches among the Iban and the Dayak, the tribal peoples who live in Borneo. And we went up river in this amazing boat. I had my 2 young kids with me and my wife, and there was one of these boats where you have the 8-cylinder engine and a kind of pole, you know, a propeller out the back, and the guy just balances the engine on the back of the boat. Because on our boat we went by the rapids, so when you get to the rapids you have to pull the boat, the engine up. It was quite fun anyway. 5 hours, and we got to the town, Valaga, where we were going to, and a couple of days after getting there we met a woman who was a kind of a flying doctor. She was going around visiting in a helicopter indigenous communities, and she said that she was encountering there all kinds of illnesses, including malnutrition, amongst the indigenous people, the Penans and the Iban. Malnutrition. The tropical forest of Borneo is one of the most fertile places on earth. If you plant a papaya seed in a little clearing in a tropical forest in Borneo, you'll have fruits within about 18 months that you can eat. You can plant rice. I mean, it's incredible to think, and the rivers are teeming with fish. But what we hadn't seen in the boat, because the government have kept a little line of trees either side of the river we've been up on, and many of the longhouses we visited, they had secondary forests around them. What we hadn't seen was the extent to which the highland of Sarawak is just bare. It's a desert. It's absolutely extraordinary. And it was that trip that made me think, if I had the privilege to become a theologian, I should devote it to the environment. So in a way, what happened in Sarawak is why I'm here today, but for me it's terribly tragic that it's still going on to this day. This man is still doing it. Now, unfortunately, there are people who protest. This slide is not quite where I thought it was going to be, but anyway, people who protest about environmental concerns in Malaysia and in other countries often don't survive to tell the tale. There was a man called Bruno Mansa, a Swiss, who went to live among the Penan to draw attention to what was happening in Sarawak and Sabah, and he disappeared. No trace of him has ever been found. It's highly likely he was killed. In South America in the last 10 years, 1,000 people have been killed for protesting about the sorts of things I'm talking about in Borneo and in Sumatra. 1,000 people. Mainly in Brazil, but also in Costa Rica, in Honduras, in El Salvador, in Nicaragua, in Peru. Basically, throughout what is largely a Catholic continent, if you protest at often Catholic family-owned businesses destroying forests, you put your life at risk. But I'm sorry to say that, I'm being rather blunt, but that's the reality, and it's tragic. So when the Pope, as I know that he has done, and hopefully will do in the encyclical, talked about the connection between peace and care for the earth, I hope that's an angle he might include, because it's extremely dangerous to be an environmentalist in some of these places, and it's really tragic. Now, of course, violence and land theft have a long history, and in my country, that history begins with the dissolution of the monasteries. So having had a go at the Catholics there, in my country, the dissolution of the monasteries is a terrible cataclysm. Buildings like this and the estates around them had developed forms of peasant, and overseen forms of peasant agriculture and distributed wealth. In medieval England, they'd overseen, of course, the development of crafts and guilds and associations in towns as well. And all of that was torn up when the English state decided to take over the 2/3 of the land of England, Scotland and Wales that the monasteries owned. Now, yeah, I mean, it's probably true to say that they probably owned too much land. But they were much better landlords and much kinder to the people than the nobility to which the land was given, and indeed the crown itself, because the crown estate still owns a lot of this land in Britain. There are much better landlords than those who came after them. And the landlords who came after them weren't satisfied with these enlarged estates they got from stealing the church's land. They then went around passing laws in the new House of Commons after the Civil War, which gave them even more land. These were the laws of enclosure. And of course, what's going on in the developing world still today is an ongoing enclosure. This began in my country. It led to the Civil War. And of course, it led to a migration of hundreds of thousands of people, dissenters, but also small farmers, landless peasants, who hated kings and monarchs and absolute power and laws, to which country? This one, right? So, the Pilgrim Fathers knew about land theft. They knew about the violence that goes with it. And they knew what happens when you protest. Because, of course, the Catholic Church, this is complicated history, but I'm just going to say it simply. In my view, the Catholic Church became the Anglican Church. In fact, I mean, it was the same priests, it was the same buildings. Of course, I know you can't say this really in public, but I mean, that seems to me what happened. In effect. And it's even more complex than that, because you know, in between Henry VIII and then you've got Mary, so then they kept all the tat and all the candles and they kept them all in boxes and buried them in the village, and then when the king changed or the queen changed, they'd get them all out again. And then you've got Elizabeth, and then they had to suppress it all again. And so, you know, for more than 100 years, the question of whether you're a Catholic or Anglican was a big issue for parish priests in my country. But anyway, a lot of that involved a lot of shed blood and a lot of violence. And it included what happened to the land, what happened to farmers. It wasn't just a religious issue, it was about the desire of merchants and bankers, backers of the English state, to wrest power from the church and to wrest power from the people and take it into the hands of the state and into the hands of merchants and use it for other purposes than well-distributed and well-cared-for land. So the dissenters came, and the Pilgrim Fathers came, and they flourished initially, and they farmed in areas like this, just south of here, of course. And the deal was that they could stake out land, and then they could register a claim to it in a land office in each area. And they had John Locke coming over from England to look at some of these activities. I've just lost the screen here, but it's still there. And he argued that it was fine that they'd taken the land from the natives because they were using it more productively than natives had. And he argued that by making money from land, you redeem it from the curse of sin, and the natives have failed to do that, the indigenous peoples. So therefore, he argued they had a right to it. But there's a famous story of a prairie farmer. He's out there with his team of, what would it have been? I guess horses, not oxen. Probably horses, a couple of horses and a little plough, turning over the prairie. And I don't know whether they were Cherokee or what I don't know what the First Nation people was around here. But anyway, say it was a Cherokee. Man comes along and sees the land, he sees the prairie, and he takes the salt and then he turns it over again. He said, wrong way up. And they didn't know how to farm here. And that's what gave you the Dust Bowl in the 20s and 30s, so powerfully displayed in Grapes of Wrath by John Steinbeck. Now the result of the Dust Bowl, as you all know, was a repetition of the enclosures here in the prairies. Most people lost their farms to the banks. They ended up in the same kind of penury, misery that their relatives had been consigned to in Georgian and Victorian slums in England. So they came for liberation. The land did initially liberate them, albeit rather ambiguously, for those who'd been here before. And then they were spewed out because by the land they didn't use it well, and the bankers moved in. So today, when you go down, as I have done, to Illinois, you just see mile after mile of vastly. In fact, it's rather prettier than most of the fields we see, and it's got a bit of a contour to it. Well, All of this is really by way of saying that what we're facing when we're talking about the environmental crisis or the crisis of the climate is not simply an environmental crisis, but a human crisis. Because at the root of environmental abuse is abuse of humans by humans. And this is well understood, it seems to me, in the Bible, and I've given extensive accounts of this biblical conception of the relationship between human injustice, human abuse of other humans, and the destruction of nature in two books, The Moral Climate and my earlier book, The Environment and Christian Ethics. It's also well understood, I think, by Cardinal Turkson, who I'm reliably informed more than once now, has written at least a draft of a possible encyclical where we're all hoping to see it in a few months' time. And he indeed uses this phrase in the lecture that he gave in Maynooth about a month ago, which seems rather like the letter he's written us, to be a bit of a trailer for what he expects to see in the redrafting of his draft. It begins to look like a kind of international diplomacy, doesn't it, when you haven't got Latin America and Africa and the Vatican, which is kind of European-dominated, all tussling. You know, it's very interesting. It'll be very interesting what they come up with in the end. Well, essentially then, perhaps the mistake that we make very often as environmentalists is to call ourselves environmentalists. Because my experience with faith-based activists is that many of them are not motivated by, like tree huggers are, by their love of trees or their love of birds. They're motivated by human injustice, human greed, human sin, and how they see that being magnified and visited on the planet through the excessive power that humans have now acquired over the planet. Now, I'm a university-based academic, and the word that's been adopted by a lot of academics in the universities now to describe the extent to which we now have extraordinary power over the earth and over all of its inhabitants. I mean, when I say we, I mean the kind of the corporations, the governments in whose hands many of these technologies are. They come up with a new word which they call the Anthropocene. So the idea is that for the last 10,000 years, roughly, human beings have lived in an era called the Holocene, which is a word that comes from ancient Greece. And essentially, the Holocene was an era of very stable, a relatively stable climate, which was relatively warm, and in which there was no ice age, obviously. So from the last ice age until somewhat recently, we've been living in the Holocene. And the Holocene's climate was determined by the relationship between the Earth and the Sun, and the tilt of the Earth, and of course the proportion of gases in the atmosphere, as we now know. But what's happening now is that we have become so powerful over the planet that we are actually changing the relationship between the Earth and the Sun by putting more gases in the atmosphere than would belong there otherwise, and through reducing the biodiversity of the seas and the forests. We're changing the carbon structure of the soils of the planet. We're putting a lot of soils into the oceans, where they don't belong and they do nobody any good. And so powerful then have our powers become over the planet that scientists are saying this is if we become a geological agent. So whereas previously geological events like a change in the tilt of the Earth's axis determined produced changes in human climate, what's now happening is that the power that we now exercise through processes like this is actually, I couldn't find the one from Chicago, this is actually the container port of Newark, New Jersey, and through large-scale urbanization and pollution like this, these are both in South America, and of course through pollution of the sky, what we're seeing increasingly is a planet so subjected to human powers that we have become the most powerful agent in the history of the planet, in the future of the planet. The future of the planet will increasingly depend upon what we decide. Now, There was another proposal before this idea of the Anthropocene that we should talk about a new geological era. Interestingly enough, it came from a North American Catholic theologian called Tom Berry. And in a way, I think that Tom Berry's idea was better than that of the scientists. Because Tom Berry argued that the reason that we're living in a new era is not particularly technology, or even particularly economics. It is economic rapaciousness, or greed. And Berry says this is not a trivial fault or minor error in our thinking and acting. It is among the most devastating things that has happened to the planet since its emergence into being more than 4 billion years ago. It is the consequence of a profound failure deep in the religious, cultural tradition itself. So Berry's devoted his life, really, to teaching about this in university. I think he was at Fordham, wasn't he? Or was it Columbia? And then he set up a study institute in upstate New York, above the Hudson River, which you can just see in the background there. And he influenced a lot of people, but he particularly influenced women religious. A number of academics, but he's widely read among Catholic women religious. So in the work I'm doing at the moment, I interviewed a group of women religious attached to a parish in Dublin, which is the first oldest eco-congregation in Ireland. And they quoted Tom Berry as the influence for the work they were doing in their parish. So essentially then, Berry's proposal is that we're not just living in a new scene, so it's not just a 10,000 year change, we're living in more like a 200 million year change. But you see, the idea of the eco-scene, or the idea of the Ecozoic era, is that he's suggesting through that idea that it's the one in which the most powerful agent in the future of the history of the Earth has become more conscious of his and her responsibility for the Earth. So it's the Zoic era, because we become ecologically sensitive to what we're doing. The danger to me with the word Anthropocene is that it can appeal to people from both sides of the argument. So, for example, there are people now who think that the only solution to climate change is to geoengineer actively the atmosphere, and not to change human behavior on Earth, not to change what we're doing to forests, not to change what we're doing in terms of traveling around, eating meat and so on, but just to sort of reboot the climate. This is an incredibly dangerous way of thinking, but the language of the Anthropocene, in a way, segs into that. It doesn't necessarily... Well, the scientists who first proposed it thought it would be a way of warning people about how powerful we've become. But there are many people who think, oh, that's rather good, have that power. The Earth now depends on us. Or we can make even more money. We can turn the whole Earth, all natural processes, towards making more money, towards growing capitalism even faster than we have been, to storing up even more wealth. So I think that Berry may have been right. Berry was also suggesting, in his idea of the Ecocene, that one of the cultural roots of the problem that we face with the planet is our mechanistic understanding of the cosmos. So our mechanistic cosmology really originated in changes in Catholic theology in the late Middle Ages. It's a long story, and I'm not going to go into it now, but it's a chapter in this book that I hope somebody might have a look at afterwards, Political Theology of Climate Change. And of course Francis Bacon plays a role in it, but so too did Thomas Aquinas, Duns Scotus, and a number of other really quite crucial people, and arguably John Calvin as well. Berry is suggesting that this metaphor, this fundamental root metaphor of modernity, that nature is a mechanism, which, as you can see there, has this medieval origin. This is an astronomical clock from the Middle Ages, which represents the whole cosmos on the Earth in relation to it as a machine. Berry suggests that this has desensitized us to the extent that we are, and the Earth is, and the cosmos is, a realm of spiritual being, and not only a realm of material and mechanical being. I also like the term the Ecozoic, because I think it's in some ways eschatological. It suggests that something of St. John Divine's vision of paradise is coming and will come on earth when we act as if it is true. This is William Blake's wonderful depiction of the river of life. And some people would argue that the book of Revelation and the picture of the river of life is very human-centered. But it seems to me that's, in a way, beside the point, because, as I've been saying in the last few minutes, at the heart of the environmental crisis is human sin, human error, human wickedness, a few people having too much power over many, many other people. And what you see in the book of Revelation is a vision of a renewed creation, which comes about as a result of the fall of earthly powers. Above all, at that time, Babylon or Rome. It's very interesting that just before the prophecy of the river of life, St. John the Divine says that the sea would dry up. Now, if you love the sea as I do, I like to go sea kayaking. It's a bit weird, you know. Why on earth would the sea dry up? I mean, presumably Lake Michigan will still be here, so you'll be all right. You'll still have a beach, but we wouldn't have much left in the UK of beaches. Why would the sea dry up? Well, in the metaphorical way that the writer is writing, the sea represented the power of Rome. How did Italy dominate Palestine? Through ships. How did St. Paul spread the gospel? Through ships. You take the sea away, you take international trade away, you take slavery away, you take the processes away that led to the enslavement of Israelites in the region of Galilee, where archaeologists have recently dug up evidence of slave hostels, where people had been put to work to bottle up fish, turn it into sauce, and ship it off to Italy. So these things come around again. I mean, industrial food and the connections with international trade and destruction are not just of yesterday. So, to me, again, the ecozoic has a kind of ecological, it has a kind of eschatological ring. And of course, this reflects the fact that one of the big influences on Tom Berry is Teilhard de Chardin, the theologian who spoke very prophetically, I think, about the relationship between science and theology throughout much of the 20th century, though I know he got into trouble with the Vatican. I probably shouldn't say any more about him. Well, this then, the troubles we face with the domination of the planet they still see no limit, and governments seem to see no limit. One of the scariest things, it seems to me, in current history is what's happening in the Arctic. On this trip I flew over just to the south of the Bay of Labrador. I've not done this trip before, so I'd never seen it before. I'd been over Greenland, but I'd not been to the south of the Bay of Labrador. And the Bay of Labrador, many people think, archaeologists think, is the origin of the flood myth. I don't know whether you know why. Can anybody think why? Well, there's a plug. If you look at the map of it, on the northeastern corner of the Bay of Labrador, there's a plug. There was a land bridge, which was broken by when the ice melted and the weight of the water broke the bridge. And when that bridge broke, I think it was around 10,000 years ago. Of course, the sea levels rose all over the world, and the Mediterranean overflowed at the Bosphorus and created the Black Sea. And of course, as you know, the flood myth of Noah is about a boat on the Black Sea, not on the Mediterranean, which ends up in Turkey. I think both the Gilgamesh epic, the Noah epic saga, but also there are flood myths from Latin America, all reflect this event. To me, what that says is that, you know, the idea that there's a hemisphere which America dominates and that it doesn't affect anything else has never been true. The world has always been connected. The New World and the Old World have always been connected. And if the United States chooses to drill oil in the Arctic National Refuge, if the Canadians decide to do the same, then that will just increase the melting of the ice of this precious cryosphere and advance climate change even faster. Now, we know the behaviours and the things that we need to do to model change. And there's signs of these in Chicago as I walk around. There's quite a lot of white lines on the roads here for bicycles. Not terribly many bicycles, but there's more bicycles than in some American cities. Partly because it's flat. You don't really need gears here, do you? I mean, presumably, well, I see a lot of fixes here. Well, I've got one in Edinburgh, but in Edinburgh, it's a form of masochism to have a single-geared bike. But here, you know, who needs gears? So we need to get out of our vehicles to get back to cycling and walking, to be self-powered by our own bodies and find the joy of that, rather than, I mean, cars misshape cities, they also misshape people. People who live in cars end up looking weird because they don't get any exercise. And we need to change our diet. And although Jesus couldn't have ridden a bicycle, it's pretty obvious that the followers of Jesus thought that he wouldn't have approved of eating meat after the resurrection. There's no evidence in the early Christian art of the first 4 centuries of Christians eating meat. All of the visual depictions of meals eaten by the disciples are of fish, of grapes, and of bread. I've never found an image from the first 4 centuries of Christians eating meat. The images of Christians eating meat come much later, 7th, 8th, 9th century. So there are, in our own tradition, resources that we can tap into. Some of them, resources that we've forgotten. And it's good to see the Vatican tapping into some of these itself by putting panels on the roof of the papal audience chamber. It's a very big roof, and no doubt has an enormous carbon footprint because quite a lot of people fly there to see the Pope in the audience chamber. So he's doing something to offset the flying. And as are parish churches, no doubt there are churches in Chicago. In fact, I think I found a slide of one, but I haven't got it here, that are doing this. In terms of what's going on in the tropics, though, since I started talking about the tropics, and what's going on in Africa and Latin America, and we've had a number of talks today about issues in both of those 2 great continents, what we need is a new kind of agriculture. It is kind of coming. We need agroforestry and agroecology. And increasingly, this is the only way that it's going to be possible to grow food in the future in countries like Kenya that are so rapidly drying out, possibly even in the Philippines in the future. Because what happens when you put trees back and native bush back into very dry land is that you change the hydrological cycle in which the crops are grown. I met a man a few years ago in World Vision in I think its HQ is in Sydney, Australia, and I was there in 2008, and he was an amazing guy. And he'd worked in Mali, and that's one of the driest places on earth. And people there, it's got farmers there, and they were trying to grow cereal crops. And he discovered that if you interplanted native bush and a cereal crop, even on very, very dry, dusty land, the native bush the root structure would help the soil to retain some moisture, and then there would be more crop. But he also discovered that, this is from colonial times, the Mali government took the view that any permanent trees or bush didn't belong to the farmer. So there was no incentive for them to plant anything other than the crop. This is a typical example of a colonial overhang, where the whole idea was to extract value from the land, to take back to Britain, or in Mali's case, France. So he had to actually persuade this government of Mali to change this very old law before he could get the farmers to change their practice. He actually succeeded. I think it was Mali, but now, if you go, I haven't got satellite pictures here, but he actually showed me a satellite picture, and you can see that the land area is beginning to green. And this guy's basically a Christian missionary. And he said to me, this is a story of hope. We can turn it around. There are still things we can do. Even in places that look hopeless, things can change. But again, it was about recovering an old practice, the old ways. And many of the things that we need to recover, I think, also from the church, are actually quite old. For me, one of the most worrying things coming to Chicago and thinking about the Anthropocene is to realize this is the town which, rather than clean up its sewerage in the late 19th century, found a way to reverse the flow of the river to stop polluting its water supply. I mean, that shows you how much power over nature it's just assumed that we have, particularly in this continent. And of course, ultimately, the river here lands up there. This is the Gulf of Mexico. And on the way, picking up all this silt from badly overplowed land, all the way through the prairies south of here, and that silt and soil ends up creating a vast dead zone the size of Connecticut on the floor of the Gulf of Mexico. And there are people who think that we've only got 100 years of topsoil left in the good farm-growing areas because of our current mechanized farming practices. 100 years. It's insane. Absolutely insane. But we have to stop this. Well, and I need to stop talking soon. I've lost, and I haven't got a clock in front of me, and I can't see one anywhere either. But anyway, I'm getting close. This, of course, is the Alberta tar sands. And kind of shocking for me, seeing the extent to which those tar sands have become kind of normalized here in North America as a source of vehicular fuel, when it's perfectly possible now to run vehicles off the sun with the technology we have. The technologies we now have, not least in the United States, you know, you could run all your vehicles on the sun because you get so much sun here. If you just collected the sun that hits Texas and the four corner states, that would be enough sun to power every home every building in North America. And if you added, you know, Utah, well, not the nice precious bits, but, you know, the flat bits, you probably could power all the vehicles too, except for the planes. We'll talk about them another time. Instead of which, this incredibly polluting and dirty practice is going on. And of course, we heard yesterday from Bill McKibben and his divestment movement. And I'm a big fan of Bill McKibben, and it's in many ways a faith-based movement, because he's a Methodist, and his Christian faith really drives him. But it won't be enough to divest in oil companies like Shell that are doing this kind of thing, because it's governments who license the extraction. And in some ways, I think the divestment movement is a distraction from the fact that it's national governments that are responsible, ultimately, for climate change and global warming. But they won't row back on this practice and practices like this, because this is a source of national wealth. They want the taxes from the fossil fuels that they have in the ground, and they don't want to be the countries which forego the taxes, which forego the wealth. So, yeah, let's have a go at the private corporations that extract this fuel, but we shouldn't fool ourselves that by attacking the stocks of those companies, we will end the extraction. All we'll do actually, arguably, is make the stocks cheaper, and possibly then that may slightly devalue the value of the companies, but it won't change the practices. Of course, here in the United States, you've had extensive protests about the possible new pipeline to take that really filthy oil down into right into the heart of onto the south coast. The Keystone pipeline, as far as I can tell, there's still an argument ongoing about that. But for me, the real difficulty, the real obstacle to fixing many of these things here in the US is that democracy is now broken in the US, and it's been broken by the corporations. Here again, weirdly, the church has a role. Where does the idea of corporate personality come from? Well, you could argue it goes back to the laws of Rome, but those laws were reinvented where and when by canon lawyers in the Middle Ages to deal with the extent to which the church had become a property owner, and including the monasteries. So the monasteries became corporations, they became corporate persons, and that meant that the monks and the nuns, the religious themselves, didn't have to own anything, but it could be owned by the corporation instead. And so the modern corporation is weirdly a secular outgrowth of the recovery of Roman corporate law through Catholic canon law in the Middle Ages. So many of these things, as Tom Berry again saw so clearly, though he didn't make this point, so many of these things do go back to the church, and that's why we have such a responsibility as church to actually put our house in order in relationship to the environment and start to unravel the roots of this in our culture. Of course, the thing that I'm speaking of in particular is the judgment of the Supreme Court Citizens United, which, I mean, I'm obviously not an American citizen, though I have worked here quite a lot over the years. My parents lived here when I was a child for a few years, but that was just, to me, such an incredible travesty of justice, and has been so destructive of real democracy in this country, not least about the environment. Now, if you look around the world, there are of course other countries that have similar problems with gargantuan power. And not the least of these is China. And China has a terrible problem with pollution, far worse, arguably, than anything that you have here in the United States. Children in China today only know that the sky is blue because their parents tell them it's blue. They never see the sky. They don't see a blue sky in their country. And they can't safely exercise outside. International schools in Beijing have constructed domes so that their children, and they have air filters and air conditioners, so that children in international schools, because they were losing their kids because the expats were just all going home. And a lot of rich Chinese are leaving too, who use their schools. So they wanted the children to exercise, so they had to construct these, otherwise their business model was going to collapse. Millions of people are trying to get out of China now because of this. It's absolutely incredible. But at the root of it is lack of democracy and inequality of power. And that inequality of power and lack of democracy, sadly, is no longer just China's problem. If you had the current politics now, when Rachel Carson would have had her book, and we learned what we know about from her and others about DDT and so on, I doubt you'd have got the Clean Water Act and the Clean Air Act. It would just have been brushed under the carpet. Inequality, human inequality, is incredibly dangerous. And the Bible is a record of the danger of inequality. It tells a story, amongst many others, not only the story of Ahab and Naboth's vineyard, but the story of Babel. Babel was essentially, the Tower of Babel was a Mesopotamian ziggurat. The temple in ancient culture, this book by Flannery and Marcus from, I think it's Harvard University Press, The Creation of Inequality, traces a pattern across a number of cultures around the world, including the Mayan civilization here in the Americas, as well as in Mesopotamia, as well as in the Far East, where large temple-building monarchic cults generate slavery, coercion, and violence, and extreme inequality. This happened over and over again in human history, and typically then they collapse through environmental crisis. In many ways, that's the story of the Bible. I mean, what is Genesis? It tells a story of how people left a garden, grew crops, started to kill each other, then they had drought, then they were enslaved, and the rest of the Bible is God's attempts to free them from that. So we are kind of replicating, in a weird way, many of these problems. I am wondering about time, but what is time? I just haven't, I'm not managed to get a watch up here. What is the time? Sorry? So how long have I got? I think I've got about 10 more slides, but we'll see. For me, Genesis is also important because the first chapter of Genesis describes the first humans, Adam and Eve, as being made in the divine image. And what for me is important about that text is that the divine image is conferred upon peasants and not upon kings. In the other kingdoms against which Israel was defined by the theologians in the Old Testament, it was the king who imaged God, and only the king. It was the Pharaoh or the king of but in the Bible it's peasants who image God. It is a deeply democratic text. When Adam delved on Eve's span, who was then the gentle man, a famous text from the late 19th century in Scotland, in England. And of course, Christ himself models the counter-model, the messianic model of leadership against the monarchic imperial model, which had been taken up, of course, in Israel itself, when Israel built an enormous temple and slew the cedars of Lebanon in order to do so. And soon after the building of that great temple, the prophets of the Old Testament described the gradual decline of Israel into the perfidy of somebody like Ahab. And so then, Isaiah famously predicted a new king would come, who would not be a powerful king, who would not dominate the people, would not drive them into war or into slavery, but who would be more like the Good Shepherd depicted in this early Christian art, which is a sarcophagus in the Museum of Early Christian Art in the Vatican in Rome. And all of the early frescoes of Christ and depictions depict him as a peasant, not as a king or a lord. And it's not even as Pantocrator. Where do the ideas of kingship and lordship he's called Lord of course, by St. Paul, and this is to reflect his heavenly status. But with the conversion of Constantine, and here you have Constantine standing not much shorter than Mary, offering gifts to the Christ child in a famous mosaic in Hagia Sophia. It's still there. The conversion of Constantine meant that those old values that Christ and the apostles had set themselves against, where kings lorded over their subjects, created inequality, steal their land, subject them to coercion and slavery, again became, gradually started to seep their way into the church and to corrupt Christian models of leadership. And so, when I look at the history of faith-based environmentalism, what I see around the world is that it's the democratic countries, the countries where there has been a modicum of equality, where there has been an attempt to redistribute land and property and wealth, and where the people have a voice. It's the democratic countries, the Protestant countries, which first were the ones to set aside national parks and so on, not the hierarchical countries. One of my big concerns, really, when addressing a Catholic audience, is that the power of the hierarchy in the Catholic Church remains in some ways an obstacle to one of the biggest environmental problems that we face, which is that there are increasingly just too many people on this planet using too much of its resources. And what the Catholic Church has done by emphasizing in the way that it has or arguing that contraception is somehow contrary to God's will for Catholic families, is deprive poor families from the opportunity, like this large family in the Philippines, of controlling their family size, and so controlling their impact on the environment. Now, weirdly, if you look at Catholics in Italy, which is the country that surrounds the Vatican, their birth rate now is down to 1.2. So in a democratic, well-educated country, people just ignore the Pope. But in a less well-educated country, well, actually education is growing in the Philippines, and I don't want to cast aspersions on the Philippines, but even when we went to Malaysia, we met people who didn't know how to control their family size. So this is not some old story. The church has to change on some of these matters internally before it can preach to the world. Depriving people of the capacity to influence church teaching on such urgent matters is a bit like, if I may use the analogy, the people of China not being allowed to influence their government when it comes to the pollution of their skies. You in North America had the democracy which enabled you to respond to the great problems that industrialism threw up, so that when John Muir wanted to save Yosemite, he was a shepherd. He wasn't a powerful man, but he managed to get to a democratically elected president and persuade Roosevelt. He persuaded him to set up a national park. When Rachel Carson, not a strong woman, published her book initially, the chemical companies tried to stop it being published. But again, you have democracy and law in this country, and the book was eventually published, and through democracy that book led to the Clean Water Act, to the Clean Air Act. It led to the foundation of the Environmental Protection Agency, and all of the environmental laws that you have in this country, most of them go back to the publication of that remarkable book. It would not have happened if this country was not a democracy, if people didn't have the right to protest. So, this is a wonderful lady in China called Chai Jin. She's a journalist. She's made a wonderful movie called Under the Dome, where she describes it. You can watch it online, and you can see in that movie what happens when you have an appallingly polluted country and no democracy, no law, which the people can appeal to stop their lives being ruined. Well, I'm just coming to the end now of my talk, but I started talking about interfaith power and lies, and I wanted briefly to end with that. I think here in Chicago and in many parts of North America, there is a movement, a faith movement, to do something about these things. It's happening in Protestant churches. It's happening among, with things like vegetable gardens, photovoltaics on the roof of churches, lifestyle changes by Christians, a whole myriad of things. If you go onto the website of Faith in Place, you'll see all the things that they're responsible for. And in the Catholic Church, my sense is that it's mainly happening not in the parishes. The greening of the Catholic Church in North America has mainly come about through the greening of the religious sisters of North America, who, thousand upon thousand, have taken up the environmental cause, have seen it as an intrinsic part of their mission, and have re-inhabited their vows, as Sarah McFarlane Taylor so wonderfully puts it in her book, Queen Sisters, which is an ethnography of the greening of religious sisters in North America. And the great challenge, it seems to me, for the Catholic Church in North America is for the men to listen to the women, particularly for the priests to listen to the religious about this. I mean, it's great that we're going to get an encyclical. Maybe that will change the priests, but the interviews I've done in Catholic parishes is that the sisters are fighting the priests. The priests don't think this is part of the core message of what happens in their church, and they're not really interested. They don't see it as part of their sacramental ministry. And I think if the church is to be greened more broadly, as apparently the Pope would like, that has to change. But the resources are there already in the Catholic Church. Well, I'm going to end with this image. This is my favourite piece of Christian art. It's in the Church of San Clemente in Rome. It's a mosaic which is reckoned to be a copy of a 5th century mosaic. It's a 9th century mosaic. But what you can see there is it's a mandala. It's not a hierarchy of the kind that I think is problematic very often with centralization of power, but whether in corporations or churches. But what you see here is Christ as a mediator between heaven and earth. You see the Son, God in heaven, Christ through the cross, but of course he's the risen Christ, he's exalted on the cross, connecting to the apostles, the whole church, and then through the root, the cross is, you see the cross is planted in the earth, and straight away plants are growing, and then you follow the arms, you follow the roots, the branches of the mandala out, and in all the branches there are different creatures, all the way out to the edge. Apostles and prophets and people and animals and birds and living things. This is our faith. This is our Catholic faith, our Anglican faith, our Orthodox faith, our Protestant faith. The resources are there in the scriptures. They are there in our art. They are there in our practices. There was a reason that monks mostly didn't eat meat until quite late on, when they just got too rich for their own good, frankly. These practices we need to recover. We don't need so much a new gospel as to rediscover the wonders and the ecological situatedness of the gospel Jesus Christ preached to us as Lord of the cosmos. Thank you very much.
The question I have, I understand your comments regarding population, but sometimes, a lot of times, that is used as an excuse by the global north to continue to support certain forms of global capitalism, right? So, and then the other issue, if we're also talking about land-based people, there may be reasons why I'm having larger families, right? So, yeah, I'm a little concerned. I understand the population issue, but I think there's a lot more complexities in terms of how that gets played out.
Well, of course, it's the whole lecture, isn't it? The whole issue of population and consumption. Somebody said to me last night that 2 nights ago, from Northwestern University, that one American child has the same consumption footprint as 52 Japanese children. And Japanese is, I choose that example because it's really counterintuitive. Japan is a highly developed culture, but it's incredibly low in terms of its consumption of natural resources because of the way they've done technology and the way they live. So I absolutely agree that it's population times consumption, and that there is a duty, arguably more on Italians because their children consume so much more, to reduce their consumption. And one of the ways to do that is by reducing the number of children. But having said that, there are many problems that are developed with overpopulation in the developing world. They already are there. I'm not making this up, it's not fiction. Yeah, I think you know this. I think you know, take Kenya for example. I mean, the Kenyan birth rate is crazy in terms of the ability of that country to support its people, particularly with declining precipitation. The whole Horn of Africa has got a problem with declining precipitation, Somalia and so on. But I mean, Kenya is one of the better educated countries in Africa, but there's still their birth rate is unsustainable. But what concerns me more is what I was speaking about more was the influence of the church in making it difficult, particularly in Catholic countries. Kenya isn't a Catholic country particularly, but in Catholic countries, for the knowledge of how to control family size to be spread around the people. Now, weirdly, this isn't just in the developing world. When I moved to Scotland, I was involved in some research in the early 90s on HIV and AIDS in Scotland. And in the middle of the research, I suddenly discovered that the Catholic Church was controlling the whole curriculum for sex education in schools in Scotland. Not just in the Catholic schools. They were controlling the curriculum throughout Scotland. So children were leaving school without adequate information at that time about how to control family size. Now, to me, I was amazed by that. So I honestly think this is a problem the Catholic Church has to address, and I think the Humana Vitae is a really unfortunate document. I just think that has had terrible consequences, not least in undermining the authority of Catholic teaching, apart from anything else. I mean, that if I was involved in being a magisterium, I'd be most concerned about having a practice which so many Catholics don't follow, because it would basically indicate to me that my authority was being undermined by some things that I thought were authoritative. I mean, we have governments have this idea that it's foolish to pass laws that are unlikely to be obeyed because they're just too expensive to enforce and they undermine the authority of the law. So anyway, I didn't hear everything that you said, but I hope that I may have answered some of what the points you made.
Is the idea of the mechanical universe by Satanus Aquinas and Francis Bacon in the 11th and 12th century really a response to so-called pagan practice of nature worship?
Say a bit more what you mean. Sorry, I didn't quite get the point.
The mechanical view of the world that was developed by the medieval theologians like Francis Bacon and Sir Thomas Aquinas, a reaction to so-called pagan practice of nature worship.
Or was it a reaction to pagan practice?
Yeah.
No, I think it was a development in Catholic and Renaissance culture. It wasn't a reaction to pagan worship. That was largely wiped out by that time in Europe. I mean, the etiology of mechanistic cosmology is quite complex, and I'm not going to have time in the next few minutes to really answer that properly. There are some excellent books which cover the topic, and I do devote a chapter to it in my book. But to me, it's one of the key influences behind the idea of a mechanistic universe was the belief in the regularity of natural laws, and that belief is underwritten by a belief in divine involvement and upholding of the universe. So there are clearly theological roots to that idea, but arguably it is displaced in early 20th century science and what some people now call postmodern science by the theory of relativity, by the Heisenberg principle, by holistic scientific understandings of things like ecology and systems thinking. So our thinking now is far more complex than it was at the time of someone like Francis Bacon. But I don't think that was the issue, paganism. I think it was a much deeper set of issues in philosophy and theology that led to that conception of mechanistic universe. But thanks for the question.
Few questions. I really appreciated in this book that you developed the idea of the communion of saints as a positive Christian framework for caring about future generations.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if you'd be willing to say more about that. I know today you focus especially on greed and sin, and of course those are all really important too, but the positive construction, I think I had not heard that before, of the communion of saints as future generations and our responsibility, or our communion with them.
Yes. Yes, that's an idea I've had for some time, and I actually got a large grant to investigate it, whether it was true or not. And one of the inconvenient things about empirical research is that sometimes one's intuitions are disproved. In the interviews I've so far done, now there haven't been very many Catholics yet in my interview sample, but in the interviews I've so far done, no one's confirmed that view that I put across in a book, A Moral Climate, which is really interesting. See, I thought that Christians, because we have this belief that the saints are still with us, you know, and the bones of the saints, and they're sort of looking down on us, and, you know, all the early Christian churches were built on the tomb of the saint, so the church was named after the saint whose bones were under the altar where the priest celebrated the Mass. So I thought this kind of rootedness in the past would give us an intergenerational ethic, different, say, to that of capitalism, which simply says, well, if you make money by the end of the year, that's what we need to worry about. So far I haven't found very much evidence of this. And in fact, I've begun to have a suspicion, and so this is, I am to a certain extent a Baconian. I do believe in empirical science. I mean, the thing that I am beginning to suspect, and I'm seeing a bit of evidence for this, is that actually the cult of the saints may be part of the problem in the Catholic Church, not the answer. Which, again, is very against what I've earlier said. Now, why do I say that? Well, you go around, you know, I often go to Europe, and you go to these very Baroque and over-ornate, you know, Spanish and French Baroque churches. They're filled with all of these statues and images, which are somehow connected with the lives of the saints in the past. So the cult of the church then gets very focused on these human and artistic objects. And I'm not at all, I actually wonder whether that cult is part of the reason why Catholic worship has oddly become detached from its roots in the agricultural year. Now, this is new thinking. I haven't proved this, but I'm trying to demonstrate. I try to do science, social science. I'm not just a theologian. And so I'm just throwing it out there as a possibility because, you see, I would argue that in the Catholic tradition, in addition to the communion of saints, another which I think is even more important, is the mapping of the liturgical year onto insolation in the Northern Hemisphere. You know, the birth of Christ is the lowest point of insolation for the crops, and then Easter, the time when spring is coming and so on, and Rogation Tide, and all the way around to Trinity and Harvest. And that mapping of the church's year onto the agricultural year is a tremendous resource for reconnecting worship and care for the earth. But then, why is it still quite difficult then to get the Catholic parishes to make those connections? And part of it may be actually oddly because there are so many saints' days all the way around, they become more important. And they kind of work. Now, I'm just thinking this stuff through, as you can hear. And Bev knows far more than I do about this, so she's going to say something.
Yeah, it's back to Constantine again.
Yeah.
So with the advent of the patronage system that accompanied attaching the church to the Roman governmental system, saints became people that you went to for like a prosperity gospel kind of thing. You go to the saints to get what you need.
Yes.
So the Tauntons to get what you need. So Elizabeth Johnson has a wonderful, wonderful book on the saints that dissects all of this. You see that what we need to do as Catholics is to reclaim that idea of saints as companions on the journey, rooted in the martyrdom, and particularly the martyrdom of women saints early in history.
Well, that's really helpful because, as you can see, my thinking has moved on since the moral climate. I'm still hopeful that somewhere I'll find an echo of my original idea and it will turn out to be true in the end. And I do actually think that theologically there is a case to be made that intergenerational justice ought to be rooted in the communion of saints. But I'm not finding much evidence of it in practice at the moment.
Let's give Professor Northcott one more.